What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Andy Norman, an award-winning author, public philosopher, and prominent advocate for the field of cognitive immunology, which studies the mind's resistance to bad ideas. Today's conversation is important because one of the central problems we face in society today is that people are losing the ability to think for themselves. And this has profound implications when it comes to not only the spread of bad ideas, but also our ability to come to agreement on good ones. It explains much of the ideological corruption, nihilism, and sense of hyper-reality that many of us experience and that I've talked about at length on this podcast. By the end of today's conversation, you will have a much better understanding of not just how mental immune systems work, but also how epidemics of nonsense spread by exploiting loopholes in the chain of reasoning that most of us rely on in order to make sense of reality and come to consensus about the nature of the world around us. In the overtime, Andy and I get into a much deeper discussion about the knowability of the world and what I believe are the limitations of science and reason in helping us get there. It's a conversation about spirituality, religion, the immaterial, and whether or not it's possible to know something authoritatively, even if you can't explain it logically or by offering evidence in support of it. We also discuss mattering theory, something we've covered in a previous episode with Rebecca Goldstein, and how to build up our mental immunity. Concrete steps, in other words, that we can rely on to become better thinkers and better brokers of information during a time when this is desperately needed. So without any further ado, please enjoy this timely and urgently important conversation with my guest, Andy Norman. Andy Norman, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you, Dimitri.
It is great having you on.
I'm really pleased to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
So you've already climbed the mountain. You've reached the pinnacle of the mountaintop because you were on Joe Rogan. So that's kind of it's kind of the wrong way to do it. You don't start at the top because everything else is kind of a letdown. So you've already gotten all the exposure you need for this book.
Well, I could always use more, and I'm pleased to get here. Not everybody watches Rogan. So.
Yeah. Well, what we're going to do here is we're going to try to go deeper if we can than what you've done on other podcasts. You've done a ton of interviews already, so Congratulations. Congratulations on the book. The book, as I will have mentioned in the introduction, is Mental Immunity. What led you to write this book, and what do you mean when you talk about mental immunity?
Yeah, so I had a conversation in college where I was basically just complaining about our species' sorry lack of wisdom. And a friend turned to me and said, "Hey, Andy, quit complaining and do something about it." And I declared my philosophy major within a few weeks. And ever since, for more than 30 years, I've been trying to understand what wisdom is and trying to figure out how we can actually spread it around and acquire a bit more of it ourselves. So I was actually teaching critical thinking, which I think is one of the most promising approaches to making us wiser. This is back in the early 90s. I was teaching critical thinking, and I suddenly realized that the standard tools of critical thinking are not doing enough to basically inoculate our minds against disinformation and other forms of viral nonsense. Now, this is in the early days of the internet, but since then, we've seen viral misinformation and disinformation spread around the world at frightening speed in ways that reinforce my conviction that bad information is actually properly thought of as a kind of mind parasite. Bad ideas, more generally, I think, are mind parasites. And we need to understand that if we're going to understand our current age. We also need to understand our mind's defense mechanisms against misinformation and disinformation. I call them mental immune systems. We now know, based on the latest science, that mental immune systems exist, and we're learning how to make them work better in ways that hold the promise, I think, of preventing future epidemics of cognitive contagion.
So what do we mean, or what do you mean when you talk about critical thinking?
Yeah, so the term goes back 100 years, and it gestures kind of crudely in the direction of idea testing and the removal of ideas that don't withstand such testing. Great idea, fantastic idea that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the Western civilization. I'm a big fan of critical thinking. But I also know from having worked with dozens of critical thinking textbooks that some of critical thinking's biggest proponents don't have the right conceptual tools to promote critical thinking properly. So let me just give one example. In higher education, where I've spent most of my life, we practically worship critical thinking. We think it's kind of the North Star of it. It's the centerpiece of what all good university education should be. But something like 80 or 90% of university professors can't even say what critical thinking is, nor the concept of critical thinking doesn't do a whole lot to structure critical thinking instruction in a useful way or to guide our attention in ways that can build our immunity to bad ideas. And I think this immunology metaphor, the idea that our minds have immune systems that we can strengthen, actually allows us to see dozens of ways to take critical thinking to a new level.
So I want to try and lead people down a path of thinking about how thinking itself has evolved. Because I reflected a bit on this in the book, and it seems to me that if I were to try and find the most catch-all definition of not just critical thinking, but the type of thinking that you strive to promote through the book, right, is ultimately one that leads to agreement with all the counterparties about whatever it is that we're discussing, the nature of reality, the nature of truth, the truth of one particular statement or another. Consensus, in other words. Does that resonate with you?
I think you get that almost right. I actually think that when we reason together, that we ought to be seeking two kinds of understanding. We ought to seek an understanding of the world. In other words, we should seek truth, but we should also seek to understand one another, and we should seek to try to think alike on the issues that are of joint concern. So I think that we need to understand the world, but we also need to have a shared understanding if we're going to collaborate together in useful ways. So I'm after an approach to reasoning and thinking that allows us to better align our views, not around any old arbitrary idea, but around actual facts and actual good ideas. So I think there's two kinds of that inquiry and dialogue and thinking together ought properly to seek a couple of different kinds of understanding.
So does that mean that you believe that there is an objective reality?
I do, yes.
Okay, and then you also believe that you can use the tools of thinking, of reason, of empiricism to obtain information about objective reality also?
That's right. And the concept of evidence has historically been very important here. The concept of evidence is that of an objectively reliable indicator of the way things stand in the world. So when you learn that something is not a reliable indicator of something, it ceases to be properly classified as evidence. So when we call something evidence, we mean that this is an indicator that is reliable enough to defer to or to take account of. And for our thinking to remain anchored in reality, we have to take account of evidence and modify our beliefs. Otherwise, our thinking can spiral away from reality and become diluted in various ways.
So how do we do that? Because one of the problems that you work through in the book is that reasoned thinking inherently runs up against some insurmountable paradoxes.
Or certainly some big biases and obstacles, for sure.
Okay, but then what I'm referring to are the axioms that we depend on in order to formulate reasons for why things are or are not.
Good.
So epistemic thinking in that regard, or the type that we associate with epistemic thinking, Socratic, relentless questioning, runs up against some challenges. And similarly, empiricism does as well, because there are limits to our ability to apprehend reality through sensory evidence?
Yeah, so you're asking some really deep questions, Dimitri. I love it. For those listening, epistemic is a kind of a fancy philosopher's word meaning having to do with cognition and thinking. And, each and every one of us, insofar as we think, are involved in epistemic things every day. Epistemology is philosophy's attempt to kind of get clear about our cognitive rights and responsibilities, an attempt to get clear about how we can think better.
And also, would you say not just what we know, but how we know what we know, our ability to justify our knowledge to ourselves and to others?
Exactly. Yeah. The founding question of epistemology is, what's the difference between knowledge and mere opinion? Why is it that we attach a so much higher weight to real knowledge? And how can we distinguish which of our beliefs are which? So philosophers have put a lot of time and effort into answering these questions over the years. And it turns out that if you delve into philosophy and learn some of what philosophers have discovered about knowledge and opinion and what makes them different, you can take those principles and they will actually strengthen your mind's immune system. They'll make you better at spotting bad ideas and better at removing them.
So I guess, have you studied, I feel like you must have based on your profession, how people came to agreement about things or investigated the nature of the world, if they even investigated it, prior to the written word, prior to their development of logic?
Yeah, well, my own understanding of that is a little sketchy, but I guess I can say a couple of things on it. So recorded history, as we know it, really begins with the written word. So we have some of recorded history goes back to before we had a phonetic alphabet, for example. So some history is recorded in hieroglyphics, for example. But the invention of the phonetic alphabet allowed literacy to become widespread. And since then we have, maybe a 3,000-year, 2,000, 3,000-year history that counts as what we call recorded history. I'm quite confident that even predating the origins of the phonetic alphabet and perhaps the origins of written language at all, I'm sure people sat around the campfire and asked questions, right, and tested each other's ideas. That sort of thing, I imagine, has been happening for thousands and thousands of years. But we had to become much more systematic about it when written language allowed ideas to spread in a kind of a viral way. So just as we're facing sort of epidemics of viral nonsense in our age, the ancient Greeks were experiencing epidemics of unhinged thinking back in their time. And so Socrates, the founder of the Western philosophical tradition, he came along and said, whoa, guys, we need a much better way to sort out the bad ideas. And I've got this thing called the Socratic method. Basically, you test ideas with the best questions you can come up with, and you only hang on to the ones that can withstand really rigorous questioning. Socrates came along at just the right time in our civilization's history to sort of raise the bar on what counts as reasonable. He taught us a method for testing for reasonableness, and I argue in the book that he, in the process, invented one of the most powerful mind inoculants of all time, namely the Socratic method.
Yeah, so and immune disruptors. But I want to stick on this point that I raised a bit earlier because my research in this area has led me to the tenuous belief that oral societies weren't burdened by the challenges of epistemology that modern societies are because they didn't have to deal with the level of abstraction. So like they didn't have to think rationally about a set of principles and derive from that a truth. They basically experienced the world as it was. So arguments about the nature of reality would never have been as basic as they've become today.
I think that's right, actually. So one of the things I say in the book is that prior to written language, ideas were the kind of thing that would just flit across your mind in the course of conversation and then kind of evaporate into thin air. And then people started writing them down. And ideas started to take on a more objective aspect. People started to see them as entities that can propagate, that can have a life of their own outside of the mind, right? And so Plato, who was Socrates' pupil, came along and said, you know what? If you focus your attention in the right way on ideas, they start to manifest a certain order and structure that suggests that there's an entire realm of ideas that's to some degree independent of this material world that we spend all of our time in. So if you join Plato in his abstract philosophizing, you actually feel like you've been transported into this other world of ideas, and you can learn to love that world. And I certainly have as a philosopher. And you start to see patterns in that world, and you start to see which ideas really stand the test of time and which ones are unlikely to. And so, yeah, that whole idea that abstraction started to make sense with the invention of the alphabet and written language, I think makes a ton of sense. I'm not sure it's an unmitigated bad. I think there's a lot of good in it too. It's maybe a mixed blessing.
Yeah. Well, I wonder how many of the problems that we have today are really stem from our inability to reconcile the mind's view of reality and what we sort of understand as physical beings in the world. And the fact that we are moving towards an increasingly digital existence, we import all of those fundamental paradoxes and difficulties that the mind has in grappling with reality. Basically, more and more of our world consists of those things. And so it becomes harder and harder to apprehend not only objective reality, if you believe such a thing is either exists or is discernible. We'll put that aside for a second, because I have questions about that. Well, not necessarily questions that I'm doing direct at you, but just questions overall. And then also, it becomes increasingly difficult to come to agreement about anything.
Right.
And it seems like that is so much of what, because in the book, you make a really great point that I had not considered. You talk about nihilism a bit in the book. It's something that I've discussed on this program quite a bit, actually, because I feel like we are moving increasingly towards a more nihilistic world. And you rest much of that blame on evidentialism as a sort of technology of the mind. And that's very interesting, something I hadn't considered. But what I focused more on, and I'd love to sort of talk about both of these things, merge them, discuss them, is the experiential side of the world. As we experience the world today increasingly through intermediated layers of technology and through digital interfaces, we no longer we've rid ourselves of the presupposition that we exist within ontological truth, which I think most people have felt that the world, they just assumed that that tree is a tree as it is. It isn't simply the reflection of light particles. It isn't this object that I experience through a multiple simulations of my brain's perception through my sensorium. People actually now understand that at the very least, they are experiencing an artificial construction of the world because that world is increasingly digitized.
Yeah, so just to echo and amplify this, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, long before we had an internet or digital technologies, human beings were trying to administer justice in a world where rumors and accusations and hearsay could circulate widely. So, right, if somebody was circulating malicious rumors about you, those rumors could take hold and spread through a population, and you could end up finding yourself accused of things you didn't do. And any system of procedural justice that was to actually try to find out and administer justice properly would have to try to distinguish fact from hearsay, right? And so long before the internet came along, the justice system came up with rules of evidence to screen out hearsay, right? So, if the opposing attorney says, objection, hearsay, the judge will say disallowed because, we try to screen out things that might distort our judgment. And now in a digital world, we have just layers and layers and layers of information and disinformation and hearsay and conjecture. And we can often feel so distant from the underlying reality that it's hard to know what's true and what isn't on the one hand. And you can also just give up caring about what's true or what isn't. So if you study the way people who've succumbed to some of the weirdest and most destructive conspiracy theories out there, a lot of times their attitude is, I don't care that this conspiracy nonsense I'm peddling isn't true. I get to be a big shot in my little conspiracy theory world, so I'm going to keep doing it.
There's the nihilism right there.
There we go.
And, something else that came up for me when I was reading the book is my relationship to Socrates evolved over the course of my reading his work, or his words through Plato, obviously.
Through Plato, yeah.
And, I had such admiration I still have admiration in many ways for him, obviously. But I came to view him as less of this objective thinker. And again, this is the Socrates that we have been familiarized about through Plato.
Mm-hmm.
But I began to see him more along the lines of a sophist. Because in some ways, you can't help but when you read, and I'm going to bring this all the way back to your point about people who maybe have these nihilistic, cynical, dark relationships to rhetoric and the use of it for their personal ends. But ultimately, Socrates was the ultimate rhetorician. He was skilled at being able to drive people to very specific ends. He didn't seem to – you sort of wonder how many of those dialogues really were, quote, objective, if they were really meant to arrive at some objective truth, or in fact they were really, Socrates really playing like a cat with like a ball of string or with like a mouse in his paws.
Yeah, he was a very skilled at debunking. So Socrates was a very skilled debunker.
He was a philosopher.
And a philosopher, right?
Exactly,
and that's kind of what we philosophers do. We do a lot of debunking, or try to. But his contemporaries viewed him as the worst form some of his contemporaries viewed him as a rhetorician who would simply make the weaker argument look stronger and the stronger argument look weaker. That was one of the charges that was lodged against him in his famous trial. Now, Socrates wasn't always, a shining example of rationality. He had a mean streak, and he wasn't above kind of producing gotcha moments that made people look silly. But most fans of Socrates, and I count myself one, think that he pretty consistently tried to distinguish the kind of rhetoric that says, to hell with the truth, I'm just going to try to win this argument, and the use of language and questions that actually tries to get at the truth. And at least in principle, most of Socrates' fans, I think, view him as of the latter sort. And so philosophers tend to say, we don't do rhetoric. We philosophers, we're the anti-rhetoricians. Now, you can debate that self-characterization. And sure, philosophers in their efforts to debunk use language in often creative ways. And sometimes we get it wrong and mislead people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no, I think, hard line between rhetoric and philosophy.
Could it be, I think this is where I'm driving at, is that, quote, hard line or soft line epistemic humility? Because for me, it seems that is, if there were a flare in the sky that I would look for when I'm debating someone, it is if I can discern a real sense of humility from that interlocutor.
I think humility is one of the most important cognitive virtues one can have. Because if you lack it, you don't have any motivation to keep learning. Mm-hmm. And so Socrates would run around debunking things. And then when people would ask him for his answer to these deep questions, he'd say, I don't know. And then he'd walk away scratching his head, and he'd leave people kind of humbled. And the overall gist of Socrates' way of engaging people in conversation was to humble them, and make them more humble.
Sure.
And he felt he lived in a time when people weren't humble enough. And that made his humbling use of the Socratic method, I think, a good thing. But of course, it produced backlash. People who didn't like being humbled, sentenced him to death and made him drink hemlock. And that's how Socrates met his end at the age of 70.
Yeah, he pissed off a lot of people. Well,
he did. And that's an occupational hazard.
A guy like Socrates wouldn't survive even as long as he did in Athens today. So let's bring it back to the practical, to the modern, because this is starting to get very interesting.
Okay.
Both from the avenue of Socrates, who was constantly questioning orthodoxy and conventional ways of thinking, something that people are not open to today. They're less open to that today, in my experience, than they've been in my lifetime.
I agree.
So let's talk about that. How the world today is different. It's changed. The real change for me has happened after the introduction of sort of ubiquitous connectivity, primarily the iPhone and the evolution of the iPhone and smartphones, and the combination of that with social media and networked applications that piggyback off human social impulses to connect, to share, and some of our worst and best impulses.
Good. Nicely described. Yep.
So how does that inform the world today? How do you see the world today? How is it different than it was? And how do you explain that evolution? And where do you begin to see those changes come into effect? And then we could talk about the repercussions and also potential solutions and how thinking can help us get there?
Yeah. So I think one of the most salutary features of our moment in history is that disinformation, conspiracy thinking, science denial, divisive political ideologies, these things are spreading or metastasizing even across the internet and infecting minds in ways that are, I think, genuinely terrifying. And I think they have a real chance of preventing us from solving, deep existential problems like climate change. And so this problem of viral nonsense, I'll call it, is I think a really pressing one. Yes. So I don't think there's any question that the new digital information technologies, the ones we carry in our pockets, the ones that serve up social media to us, that these are a huge contributor to this disinformation problem we have these days. And it's allowing disinformation to create dislocation and partisan division in ways that are unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. But it's also true that our humanity has struggled to protect itself against divisive ideologies and disinformation and salacious rumors and lies for thousands of years. So our particular moment in history has to be understood in light of recent technological developments, information technologies in particular, and in terms of the ancient quest to try to make us a bit wiser. And long before the internet came along, philosophers were struggling to contain epidemics of nonsense. Our best efforts to make humanity wiser have fallen far short of our hopes and expectations. And so we need better ways to inoculate our minds against viral nonsense, especially now because we're all plugged into this global beast called the internet.
So what do you think technology has done? How has technology done that? How much have you thought about the role of some of what I've described, hyperconnectivity? And when I talk about hyperconnectivity, what I'm really getting at is the merging of the digital and the analog worlds, so that when you go on the internet, you're no longer going on the internet any more than you're plugging your toaster into the electrical grid. It's just these things are all sort of part of the world that we live in. And that becomes increasingly true with IoT and all of these connected devices that used to just be standalone.
Yeah. So compare when you first started using online applications, right? You might check in once or twice a day. And when we started, maybe we spent half an hour or an hour a day on this. And nowadays, of course, kids are growing up and they actually spend the bulk of their waking hours scrolling on their iPhones or, surfing on the web. And that's a profound change. And the sense of dislocation, the sense of rootlessness, the nihilistic fears and anxieties that bubble up in a world like that. I mean, depression and anxiety are at record levels among young people.
Everyone's become a philosopher. Everyone's stuck in their head today. You know what I'm saying?
Everybody's stuck in their head, but everybody needs philosophy more than ever, I think, too.
No, 100%. What I mean is, and I got this sense from reading your book, or maybe I was projecting, but I went through a really dark period in my early 20s when I was really reflecting on existential questions and taking philosophical courses and thinking about these issues. And ultimately, I came away with the view that at least part of that is simply because the types of answers I was looking for are not answerable. And they may, in some ways, be simply the result of overthinking.
Can I riff on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I love this. So existentialism is a school of philosophy that paid a lot of attention to the concern that maybe nothing really matters objectively.
Right.
So what if it's all meaningless?
And there's no ability to actually, I think as well, there's no ability in that context, in that view, to really say anything conclusive about anything other than perhaps that you yourself exist.
Well, I think that was the state of existentialist thinking a while back. I think we have some new developments in what I call mattering theory, and I'm happy to talk about that. Mm-hmm. So existentialists were really worried about, does life have meaning? And the idea was that we can feel like it has meaning, but that's merely subjective thing, not an objective thing. And so really deep down, life doesn't really mean anything. These are the questions that Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and Dostoevsky really worried about a lot. And I've actually counseled young people today who feel that the world is desperately devoid of meaning, and why bother even persisting in a world like that? When ideas like this start to spread and people start to take them seriously, they start to realize that persistent questioning about what really matters, what really has meaning, can be incredibly corrosive of our emotional and social well-being. But there's this new thing called mattering theory that actually tries to think in objective ways about what matters. And I will be arguing in my next book that some things really do objectively matter, and that existentialists overlooked this fact or didn't quite know how to think about it in the right way, but that we can escape from nihilistic attitudes and the kind of depression they often induce by understanding better what matters and why things matter.
Well, we actually did an episode with Rebecca Goldstein on exactly this subject a couple of years ago.
Yeah, she's great, isn't she?
She is. She's fantastic. She wrote a book, I think it was called Plato at the Googleplex, that I read in preparation for that conversation.
Yep.
She also wrote a great biography of Gödel's. And we also had another episode. Again, I encourage listeners to go back and look at our library on philosophical episodes. We did one on philosophical mathematics with Wittgenstein's biographer, not obviously authorized, Ray Monk. And we also
did you?
We did indeed. It was
I'm gonna have to check it out.
It was fascinating, and it deals with many of these sort of paradoxes and issues around axiomatic truths and how to come to any sort of not just deterministic view of reality, but deterministic view that arises from first principles that we can trust.
Right.
And we also did one with Patrick Grimm. I want to encourage people to listen to a really great episode dealing with the mind-body problem, which we're kind of touching on here. We can go in all different sorts of rabbit holes here, Dr. Norman. I'm trying to think about, there's something else that you wrote about in the book, which I also thought was super interesting.
Well, you brought up, you mentioned evidentialism earlier. I haven't circled back to that one.
Sure, that would be great. So let me posit something and then let's circle back to that because I don't want to forget it, and I'll write it down as well, which is the way that you try and describe or come at from a different angle what has been going on in society today, which is this phenomenon of people splitting up into two different camps, one of which seems to be overly credulous, willing to believe any authority figure that comes their way. So whether Anthony Fauci comes out and says no masks, they all say no masks. If you wear a mask, you're hoarding important equipment and you're a horrible person. And then if Anthony Fauci comes out and says, no, you have to wear a mask, they say you have to wear a mask. If you don't wear a mask, you're trying to kill people. You've got that group, all right? And then you've got the people who seem to be willing not only to believe in anything, but actually, interestingly enough, and this is where I want to challenge you or try to understand better what you're trying to suggest. This particular group isn't just willing to indulge any conspiracy. They are specifically not willing to accept mainstream or otherwise consensus views of reality or consensus or authoritative explanations for anything. And you describe that in terms of an overactive or underactive immune systems. In other words, people who are willing to believe whatever it is that the authorities tell them may have an underactive immune system.
Right.
Whereas those who are really picking apart any theory with sort of, well, how can you prove that? A sort of endless logical regress. These folks have an overactive immune system that they're attacking even good information. So I want to explore that, but I would love to help our listeners understand the evolution of thinking from Socrates, Plato, David Hume, and how we got to evidentialism, which is sort of like a merging of epistemic philosophy and empirical analysis.
Gotcha. That was really nicely said, and there's a lot there. So if you study epistemology, this branch of philosophy that tries to figure out how we can all think better, and you study its history in detail, you realize that different standards of responsible believing have waxed and waned over the years and ushered in dramatically different phases in our civilization's history. And some of those phases were animated by hyper-credulous epistemic standards, hypercredulous ideas about what counts as responsible thinking. And that resulted in things like the Dark Ages, where dogmatism and superstition flourished, right? But other times in our civilization's history, hypercritical standards have taken hold and actually done a lot to remove stubborn closed-mindedness, but also swept away a lot of good ideas in the process. And so if you look back at this history through the lens of what I call cognitive immunology, the lens of mental immunity talk, you start to realize that our mental immune systems have been swinging back and forth between hyperactive and underactive. Or more precisely, I guess, there are certain people who get really excited about, for example, evidentialism, the idea that only evidence-based beliefs are worth believing. And because of that word only, because that standard says throw away everything else, philosophers get really excited about that because they can use that idea to debunk misperceptions and destructive ideologies. And they start to use it like an axe to hack away at those things. But other people are really worried that this don't believe anything except what the evidence shows you, that might be too corrosive for our own good. And they get really anxious and they dig their heels in and they say, except for my articles of faith. Leave my articles of faith out of this, because they have a sense that just as it's possible to be undercritical, it's also possible to be overcritical. And so they push back. And if you go back and interpret our civilization's history through this lens, you start to see that a whole bunch of mental immune systems get overcritical or hyperactive and start pushing in the direction of removing the bad ideas. And other people get anxious that their articles of faith or their cherished convictions will be threatened, and they dig their heels in and they cling more tenaciously, which is to say their mental immune systems become underactive and they push back. And the way to end these culture wars that have divided our civilization for so long is to actually understand how mental immune systems work and figure out how to strike the happy balance between hyperactive and underactive. And that's where genuine mental immune health lies. And if we get clear about that, we can begin to resolve the differences between the religious and the secular, the conservatives and the liberals in principled ways, and bring about the kind of harmony and prosperity that we've always struggled to achieve.
So we're going to get into how to do that, how to build up mental immunity in the second part of today's conversation, Andy. But at least for this part, can you help me and our listeners understand what you mean when you talk about mental immunity in specific terms, like how does it work? What is it?
Yeah. So our bodies have immune systems, and they function to protect us against infectious ideas. They function more or less well. Sometimes parasites get past them and damage our health. Other times our body's immune systems go on hyper alert and even attack the body's own tissues. Like if you ever suffer allergies from pollen or like hay fever, that's your body overreact. That's your body's immune system overreacting to an essentially harmless thing, pollen. In what we now know on the basis of about half a century of research, that our minds have immune systems too. In other words, our minds perform operations to spot and remove infectious ideas. They can do this more or less well. Their functioning can actually be compromised in various ways. In other words, we can become mentally immune deficient, something like AIDS of the mind is a real thing.
Yeah, I actually subtitled that section in the rundown, Cognitive Immunodeficiencies.
Yeah, exactly. So there are cognitive immune deficiencies and there are cognitive autoimmune disorders, which is where your mind's immune system becomes hyperactive. So think about the flat earth theorist, right, who has 10 reasons lined up for why pictures from space showing the earth to be spherical, why those are all a part of a hoax, right? That's a mental immune system that has become so hyperactivated that it's attacking good information and letting bad information past, right? And one way to think about this is that doubts and questions are the real antibodies of the mind. Just as your body's immune system marshals white blood cells to fight off invaders, your mind will marshal questions and doubts to try to fight off what it perceives to be invaders. And sometimes it'll attack the wrong things.
So the flat earth theorists and theory community is actually a great example of this, because I think it highlights how truly tenuous our connection to reality and to truth is when we begin to investigate the question of how do we know what we think we know. So if someone were to go about trying to answer this question of how do I know that the earth is spherical, it ultimately rests on assumptions. And even the mathematics that undergirded the earliest theories of the earth's sphericality, before we even had astronomical observations or practical demonstrations of circumnavigation that provided empirically conclusive evidence that the earth is not flat, even then, all of those things ultimately rest on assumptions about the knowability of the world and the relationship between the data we collect and ontological reality.
So you're raising a wonderfully deep question, Dimitri, and this is one that I've studied for much of my adult life, and it has a fascinating effect on our civilization's attempts to figure out what it means to think well. So you said it, let me pick on a phrase you used early on, that our beliefs about the world's sphericality ultimately rests on assumptions. I'll quibble with that to the extent that I think evidence is not merely an assumption. So to the extent that we actually know the world, I think we fully know the world to be spherical or roughly spherical. And we know it based on evidence. And the evidence is now overwhelmingly strong. And that means that it's not mere assumptions that lie at the basis of this belief. Evidence lies at the basis of this belief. And remember the definition of evidence I gave earlier. It's a reliable indicator of the way things really are.
But don't we rely on ourselves as the instrument for measuring the information that we use to make empirical judgments?
Well, anytime you think, you rely on your mind, right? And our minds do deceive us sometimes, and our senses deceive us sometimes. So all of these things are worth acknowledging because they're true, right? Sometimes we see things that aren't there, and sometimes we fail to see things that are there. And so it always helps to have a kind of a healthy skepticism about, purported evidence. So if somebody claims to have good evidence, don't always take it at face value. We need to be somewhat critical. But the trick is not to become so skeptical that it kind of consumes the ground you stand on.
But we're moving into an age now, Andy, where technology is offering us the opportunity to see how we could, in this real world, enter a place where I could plug you into a machine and you would lose all sense of this world. And you would have no ability to discern the quote, real world from a simulation, which incidentally I think is why simulation theory has become so popular amongst the retail crowd, so to speak.
Well, and this reality is already with us to some degree,
right,
with the fact that I'm staring at a computer screen right now and do for many hours every day.
Right, and you have a conception of what you think this screen is, but what I'm suggesting is that perhaps even it isn't what you think it is, and we really don't have an ability to empirically, at least in sort of the spirit of empiricism, make definitive statements about the nature of the world we live in when we can create a thought experiment and conclude through that experiment that it's perfectly possible that you and I are in a simulation right now being run on some kid's computer on some, random planet in this universe that we still, again, can't really say anything empirically about in the truest sense of the word.
And of course, many young people today encounter that idea first with the Matrix movie, for example.
Oh, 100%, right? Yeah.
What if we're all just plugged into the Matrix? Well, philosophers have been, so René Descartes ran his own version of the French philosopher that, goes back 400 years now almost. He had his own version of the Matrix possibility. He basically asked, what if we're dreaming it all up? What if what we think of as reality is all being piped into our minds by some evil demon that is systematically misleading us about the nature of reality? How do you know that that's not the real what's really going on. Now, it turns out philosophers have studied this problem in great detail, and it turns out that it's really, really hard. So one of the neat features about this possibility that, say, we're dreaming it all up, is that any conceivable evidence that you might imagine yourself discovering is in principle dreamable, right? And once you recognize that, you can start to feel as though the entire ground has been pulled out from under you, like you just don't know anything. And so there are very extreme forms of skepticism that philosophers have been playing with and trying to figure out, how do you combat somebody who might just doubt everything, right? Or just claim we don't know anything. And in my book, I actually take these problems very seriously and show how you can answer them, and show that these ancient forms of skepticism peddled by Descartes and others, the problem with them is that they reject everything wholesale and basically say, how do we start from scratch? And it turns out if you toss out everything, there's nothing to build anything new upon. Now, Descartes basically said, well, at least I know I think, at least I know I am, right? I think, therefore I am, was his way of trying to get back in the game after this completely corrosive skepticism had basically left him feeling, intellectual vertigo. And I think we're at a moment right now where movies like The Matrix and the reality that you're talking about, right, where so many of us are fed simulations for so much of the day that we start to wonder whether any of it's real. The problem is it turns out to be a big mistake to just throw everything out all at once wholesale, because you do that and there's no way back from nihilism. There's no way back from rabbit holes of your own making. The trick is to realize that skepticism is healthy when it's discriminating, and use skepticism piecemeal, not wholesale, and your mind will become healthier.
Well, like I said, in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, I went through a really dark phase where I deconstructed everything, or at the very least deconstructed my way to nothingness. And I came to the view later in my life, not long ago, that asking the question, what is fundamentally real, is the wrong question. It's not knowable, and it's a waste of time. And instead, what I have adopted is a view that science and reasoned thinking is a way for me to get better at playing this simulation.
Okay.
And that questions about what the nature of reality is, where I come from, where I'm going, things like this, are really unanswerable and perhaps relevant, perhaps important, but that I'm not going to arrive at philosophical answers to those questions. That if there is a truth there, I'm going to find it through some sort of authoritative experiential experience, a theosophic moment.
So with the position you just articulated, Dimitri, is related to the very well thought out view of Immanuel Kant. So he was a German philosopher who basically said, real reality is ultimately unknowable because it's always viewed through the clouded lens of our minds, basically, right? So he rejected objective knowledge of reality and basically said the most we can do is to develop a responsible simulation of reality or something like that.
Practically useful. That's sort of the way that I view it.
Useful, yeah. And I guess my own view differs from this a little bit. I think the only reason you get to the point where you toss out all of objective knowing about reality is if you indulge in that kind of wholesale
radical skepticism
first and then try to claw your way back. I'm actually arguing for a view where the radical skepticism is self-problematic for identifiable ways. So you don't let it get its hooks in you in the first place, and instead take a more discriminating and sort of piecemeal approach to weeding out the bad ideas.
It reminds me of actually, so like I said, early 20s, I left, the sort of pinnacle of my crisis happened my senior year. It's also interesting how these types of existential crises intersect with other more tangible events in people's lives. I was graduating. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Similarly, I had similar experiences after the 2008 financial crisis because it shook so many of the preconceptions I had around power and the constraints that existed around institutional authority. I think that's contributed to a big part of the psychosis that has occurred in our society as well.
Yes.
But it reminds me, your explanation for how you view things. It reminds me of actually what I dealt with when I graduated college and I went to work in Italy, and it was sort of an escape from the world. And I would have these, and I experienced massive existential anxiety. I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. I was afraid to open my eyes because I didn't trust the floor. We're talking about like really,
right. Wow.
Yeah, we're talking about
that's intense.
Yeah, hardcore solipsism.
And you're pointing out that it's not, and rightly I think, that it's not just sort of academic skepticisms that can lead to radical doubt about everything. It's also like economic dislocation.
Anything that upends our false belief that there is something firm and tangible in the world that we can hold on to, that our mind's conception of the world can be in some ways concrete. And what I came to realize at some point, again, I'm reiterating my position on this, is that there is no conclusive statement I can make about the world that I can back up with concrete evidence that isn't built on some basic levels of assumptions. But the point I wanted to make was it reminded me of when I moved to Italy and I started therapy that summer to deal with some of these issues, and I was dealing with massive anxiety. And when I went to Italy, I sort of tried to take it out of my mind, but every now and then it would reinsert itself, and I would get this terrifying level of anxiety of like, there's really, I'm just living in an empty space. It actually fed a sort of deep, profound sense of loneliness.
Yeah, and if you were a religious person, that might feel like a crisis of faith or something, right?
Well, except faith, I think, addresses that existential loneliness and angst that arises. Yeah, I think it can if you genuinely believe it, or if you've had theosophic experiences to that effect.
I think that's exactly right. I think for many people, articles of faith sort of provide a grounding that, keeps the floor from, falling out from under them, right? It gives them a foundation to build on, or they feel that way. But the very fact that many people of faith experience crises of faith indicates that faith is a kind of a shaky thing to build your understanding of the world upon. If you want a worldview that's genuinely stable under questioning, and one that is less susceptible to crises of this sort, I think it's better to go a different route and to actually seek an understanding of reality, number one. And going back to, I think a minute ago, Dimitri, you suggested that, you're not sure there's anything that you have objective evidence for, but surely that's not true of your belief that there is a microphone in front of you. You really think that's objectively true, do you not?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I believe that there is, at the very least, it might be true that there is objectively true a microphone before me. But what I genuinely believe to be true, for sure, at the very least, is that there is a simulation that is running somewhere, somehow, not necessarily on a computer. My mind is a simulation, or my mind generates a simulation of reality, right? The microphone doesn't look anything like this. It looks like this to me. It looks like something totally different to other animals, insect species, and to other forms of instrumentation, technological and otherwise, that would perceive information that's bouncing off of this object, right?
You're not wrong, Dimitri.
Yeah, well, exactly. So when you begin to study the details of the science that tells us what the world looks like, you begin to appreciate how profoundly different the world is, at the very least, between how we experience it and what the latest science tells us it is.
And can I amplify that point?
Absolutely. Before you do, just hold that, Andy, because I want to make sure that we get at some point to the overtime. So we'll continue that part of the conversation in the overtime. I also want to tell listeners I want to continue our conversation on faith because I think it's interesting, and I think it's interesting also to tease out or to define what we mean when we talk about faith, because I do want to distinguish between ideological forms of believing and a general faith in the mystery of the universe and the unknowability of it, and what that inspires, what that conjures in terms of spirituality. I do absolutely want to get into the specific details that you enumerate in the book and the steps around building mental immunity, because I think it's very practical. And further to that point, I want to explore this model for practical thinking.
Okay.
For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Andy, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the Overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Andy, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation into the subscriber overtime.
All right.
Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.